At exactly 11:47 p.m. on October 15, 2019, Crystal Lucian was doing what she did every Tuesday night for the past 4 years. She was stocking medical supplies in the basement storage room of Riverside General Hospital, methodically organizing IV bags and syringes under the harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead like angry wasps. To anyone watching the security cameras, Crystal looked like any other night shift employee. Competent, reliable, forgettable. But no one knew that Crystal had arrived at work 3 hours early that night, and no one knew what she had carefully hidden in locker 247 before her shift began. By 6:23 a.m. the next morning, 8 of her co-workers would be dead, their bodies scattered across 3 floors of the hospital, each victim killed with surgical precision, each name crossed off a handwritten list that Crystal had been perfecting for over 2 years. What investigators found in that list will shock you. Because this wasn't a random workplace shooting. This wasn't a mental breakdown. This was revenge, cold, calculated, and years in the making. Welcome to Shocking Murd3r Files. If twisted minds and dark psychology fascinate you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of true crime enthusiasts who aren't afraid to dive deep into the darkness. The question that haunted detectives wasn't just how Crystal Lucian killed 8 people in less than 7 hours. It was how someone so invisible, so overlooked, had been planning the perfect workplace massacre right under everyone's noses. And the most chilling part, she almost got away with it. LifeSpring Hospital's night shift was a world unto itself. While the day staff bustled through well-lit corridors filled with visitors and the constant hum of activity, the overnight crew worked in a different reality. Dimmed hallways, skeleton staff, the kind of quiet that made every footstep echo like a gunshot. The night shift at LifeSpring ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and it attracted a specific type of employee. Some were there by choice, the night owls who preferred the peace and the slightly higher pay differential. Others, like Crystal Lucian, had been assigned there because management needed bodies, and she never complained. Crystal worked in Central Supply, the hospital's nerve center for medical equipment and pharmaceuticals. Located in the basement, it was a maze of storage rooms, supply closets, and sterile corridors that connected to every department in the building through a network of service elevators and back stairwells. On any given night, Crystal would interact with employees from across the hospital, nurses needing extra supplies for their floors, maintenance staff checking equipment, security guards making their rounds, the cafeteria worker who restocked vending machines, laboratory technicians processing overnight specimens. For 4 years, Crystal had been the reliable one, the one who knew where everything was stored, the one who stayed late when shipments arrived unexpectedly, the one who covered shifts when others called in sick. She was also the one nobody really knew. Crystal was just there, would later say Amber Johnson, a night shift nurse who worked the cardiac unit. You'd see her in the hallways pushing supply carts or restocking closets. She'd nod hello, but that was about it. She kept to herself. The truth was, Crystal had been keeping to herself for good reason. Because while her co-workers saw a quiet, competent employee, Crystal saw something entirely different when she looked around that hospital. She saw enemies. But what happened on October 15th didn't start that night. It started 3 years earlier, with a promotion that never came and a birthday cake that didn't have her name on it. Crystal Lucian started at LifeSpring in September 2015, hired as a supply technician level 1 with promises of advancement opportunities and a close-knit work environment. She was 29 years old, recently divorced, and desperately needed the steady income and health insurance. Her ex-husband Derek had left her for a younger co-worker at his accounting firm. The divorce had been brutal. He'd taken half of their savings and left Crystal with nothing but debt and a bitter taste for workplace relationships. She'd sworn she would never again let people treat her as disposable. Crystal's first months at LifeSpring seemed promising. Her supervisor, Trevor Walsh, seemed impressed during her orientation. Crystal rarely made mistakes, never called in sick, and volunteered for overtime shifts that others avoided. She learned the hospital's supply chain faster than any previous hire, memorizing the locations of thousands of medical items and mastering the complex computer inventory system. Her annual review in 2016 was glowing. exceeds expectations in every category. Trevor even mentioned that Crystal was management material and encouraged her to apply for advancement opportunities when they became available. Crystal took that advice seriously. She enrolled in online courses for healthcare administration. She studied hospital management textbooks during her breaks. She volunteered for special projects and committees that would give her visibility with upper management. But when the supply technician level 2 position opened up in early 2017, Crystal didn't get it. The promotion went to Jolene Rivers, a newer employee who'd been there less than 18 months. Jolene was 24 years old, blonde, bubbly, and had a habit of bringing homemade cookies to staff meetings. While Crystal had been quietly excelling at her job, Jolene had been making friends, organizing happy hours, and charming everyone from the janitorial staff to the chief medical officer. When Trevor announced the promotion during the monthly all-hands meeting, he said Jolene had excellent interpersonal skills and would be a great fit for the expanded responsibilities that require extensive collaboration with other departments. Crystal sat in the back of that conference room and felt something cold settle in her chest. Excellent interpersonal skills. The message was clear. Crystal's competence, her dedication, her superior knowledge of the systems. None of it mattered as much as being likable. She wasn't friendly enough, wasn't chatty enough, wasn't enough, period. After the meeting, Crystal approached Trevor privately. "I'd like to understand what I can do differently to be considered for future promotions," she said carefully. Trevor looked uncomfortable. "Crystal, you're a fantastic employee, really. But leadership positions require someone who can connect with people more easily. Maybe work on being more social, join some of the employee committees, get to know your co-workers better." That night, Crystal went home to her empty apartment, the same apartment she'd lived in since the divorce because she couldn't afford anything better, and opened a composition notebook she'd been using to track her work assignments. On a fresh page, she wrote Jolene Rivers at the top. Underneath, she wrote 10/12/17, got my promotion. Trevor says I need to be more social. Translation, I need to be young and pretty. It was the first entry on what would become her list. The second entry came 6 weeks later. The hospital staff were celebrating Bethany Kim's 25th birthday, with cake in the break room. Crystal had worked there for over 2 years, but somehow her birthday in August had passed without acknowledgement. When she mentioned this to Veronica Santos, the department secretary, Veronica just shrugged and said, "Oh, we didn't know when your birthday was." But they'd known Bethany's birthday. They'd known she preferred chocolate cake over vanilla. They'd known to order from her favorite bakery and to pass around a card for everyone to sign. They'd even decorated the break room with balloons. Crystal had watched through the break room window as her co-workers laughed and joked with Bethany, taking selfies and making plans to continue the celebration at happy hour after work. Nobody had invited Crystal to happy hour. Nobody ever invited Crystal anywhere. That night, Veronica Santos, 11/28/17, claims she didn't know my birthday was in August. Lies. She knew everyone else's. HR has all our birthdays on file. This was intentional exclusion. The entries started coming faster after that. Every slight, every perceived injustice, every moment when Crystal felt invisible or dismissed got carefully documented in her neat handwriting. When Tyler Morrison, a maintenance worker, started a workplace romance with Casey Mitchell, a day shift nurse, and everyone thought it was adorable, except Crystal, who'd harbored a quiet crush on Tyler for months. She'd tried making conversation with him during their overlapping shifts, but he was always polite and distant. When Casey came along with her bright smile and easy laugh, Tyler suddenly became talkative and flirtatious. Crystal wrote, "Tyler Morrison, 12/15/17, ignores me completely, but falls all over himself for Casey. Even the maintenance guy thinks he's too good for me." When Shane Cooper, the night security supervisor, wrote her up for being 10 minutes late on a night when she'd stayed 3 hours past her shift to help with an emergency supply shortage, Crystal had been the only supply technician available when a multi-car accident filled the emergency room, and she'd worked until 10:30 a.m. processing urgent blood supply requests. But when she was 10 minutes late for her next shift, Because she'd overslept after getting only 4 hours of rest, Shane wrote her up without considering the circumstances. Shane Cooper, 1/22/18, wrote me up for being late after I saved his ass during the emergency. No consideration for the extra work I did. No appreciation. When Brett Daniels, the head of Central Supply, passed her over again for a promotion in 2018, this time choosing an external candidate named Dustin Park, who didn't know the hospital's systems and would require months of training that Crystal ended up providing. Dustin was fresh out of college with a healthcare administration degree and immediately earned a salary that was $8,000 more than what Crystal made after 3 years of experience. Brett Daniels, 6/8/18, hired outsider for supervisor position. I have to train him on systems I built. He makes more money than me on day one. Brett told me I'm not ready for leadership, but college boy with 0 experience is. Each incident was catalogued. Each name was added. Each grievance was cross-referenced with dates, witnesses, and Crystal's interpretation of what had really happened. The notebook became a detailed record of every workplace interaction that had left Crystal feeling diminished, overlooked, or humiliated. By 2019, the notebook contained 43 entries across 17 different co-workers, but 8 names appeared repeatedly. 8 people who had, in Crystal's mind, gone out of their way to humiliate her, overlook her, or actively work against her advancement. Trevor Walsh had made promises about her potential, and then broken them when someone prettier came along. Jolene Rivers had stolen the promotion that should have been Crystal's, using charm instead of competence. Veronica Santos had orchestrated Crystal's social exclusion, forgetting her birthday while remembering everyone else's. Tyler Morrison had treated her like she was invisible while openly flirting with other female co-workers. Shane Cooper had punished her for dedication, writing her up for being late after she'd gone above and beyond her duties. Brett Daniels had consistently passed her over for advancement, preferring less qualified candidates with better social skills or more impressive credentials. Dustin Park had waltzed into a position Crystal had been working toward for years, immediately earning more money and respect. Bethany Kim represented everything Crystal resented: young, popular, effortlessly social, the kind of person who got birthday parties and workplace friendships without even trying. The list had become Crystal's Bible. Every night before work, she would review it. Not in anger. Anger was messy and unpredictable. She reviewed it with the methodical precision of someone planning a project, because that's what this had become, a project, with a very specific end goal. Crystal began to see patterns in her co-workers' behavior, the way they formed cliques and excluded others, the way they rewarded personality over performance, the way they created an inner circle of popular employees while treating others as expendable. She started taking notes on more than just personal slights. She documented the hospital's power structure, the informal alliances between departments, the gossip networks that spread information faster than official communications. Little did they know, Crystal had started researching more than just workplace grievances. She'd been studying the hospital's security protocols, the staffing schedules, the locations of security cameras and their blind spots, the response time for emergency services to reach the basement levels. She'd also been studying something else: true crime cases involving workplace violence. She read about postal workers who'd snapped under pressure, office workers who'd brought guns to staff meetings, factory employees who'd turned on their co-workers after years of perceived mistreatment. Crystal learned from their mistakes. Most workplace shooters were caught quickly because they acted impulsively, in anger, without proper planning. They used noisy weapons that alerted security. They attacked during busy periods when witnesses were everywhere. They left evidence trails that made prosecution easy. Crystal was going to be smarter than that. What happened next would show just how thoroughly Crystal Lucian had prepared for her night of reckoning. At exactly 8:23 p.m. on October 15th, 3.5 hours before her shift was scheduled to begin, Crystal Lucian used her employee badge to enter LifeSpring Hospital through the staff entrance on the east side of the building. Security footage would later show her walking calmly through the dimly lit corridors, carrying what appeared to be a standard employee lunch bag and a small duffel bag she sometimes used for gym clothes. To anyone who might have seen her, Crystal looked exactly like what she was supposed to be: an employee coming in early to catch up on work. But Crystal hadn't been to the gym in over a year, and the lunch bag contained something that would make veteran homicide detectives question everything they thought they knew about workplace violence. Crystal's first stop was locker 247 in the employee changing area. It was her assigned locker, and she had the only key. What she removed from her lunch bag and carefully placed inside would remain hidden for the next 3 hours and 14 minutes. A claw hammer. Purchased 6 weeks earlier from Morrison's Hardware, a small family-owned store 30 miles away from the hospital in the town of Cedar Falls. Crystal had paid cash and worn a baseball cap and sunglasses despite shopping in the evening. She'd learned from true crime podcasts that preparation meant thinking about evidence, about cameras, about paper trails. The hammer was perfect for her purposes, 16 ounces, heavy enough to be lethal with a single blow, but not so heavy that she couldn't control it precisely. The claw end could puncture skull if needed, while the flat striking surface would deliver massive blunt force trauma. Quiet enough to not immediately alert other staff members, personal enough to feel satisfying when she imagined using it on the 8 names that had been burned into her memory. Crystal had practiced with the hammer for weeks in her apartment. She'd set up a mannequin in her living room, the same one she'd used for CPR training during her orientation, and practiced different striking angles. She'd tested how much force was needed to crack a watermelon, which she'd read online was similar in density to a human skull. She'd also been studying anatomy textbooks, learning about the most vulnerable areas of the skull, the locations that would cause instant death versus prolonged suffering. Crystal didn't want her victims to suffer. This wasn't about sadism. This was about justice. Quick, efficient justice. Crystal's second stop was the Central Supply Office, where she logged into the computer system and pulled up the night shift assignments for October 15th. She'd done this dozens of times over the past 2 months, memorizing who would be where and when. But tonight was different. Tonight she was confirming final details. Jolene Rivers would be restocking the cardiac unit on the 4th floor until approximately 1 a.m., then returning to Central Supply to process overnight inventory. She always took the service elevator, never the main ones where she might encounter patients or visitors. Veronica Santos would be in the administrative offices on the 3rd floor until midnight, updating payroll records and processing supply requests. Then she would begin her security rounds of the supply closets, a task that took her through isolated areas of the hospital. Tyler Morrison would be checking HVAC systems in the basement mechanical rooms between 11:30 p.m. and 2 a.m. He always worked alone during these checks, following a route that took him through the most isolated parts of the building. Shane Cooper would be making his first security round of the basement at exactly 12:45 a.m., just like he had every Tuesday night for the past 3 years. His route was predictable. He always checked the mechanical rooms first, then the storage areas, then the administrative offices. Brett Daniels had switched to day shift 6 months earlier, but Crystal had learned he sometimes came in early on Wednesday mornings to prepare for department meetings. If he followed his usual pattern, he'd arrive around 6:30 a.m. Dustin Park worked the evening shift and would be leaving at 11 p.m., but he often stayed late to finish paperwork. His car was always parked in the same spot in the employee garage. Bethany Kim was scheduled to work a double shift, covering for a sick co-worker. She'd be in the laboratory on the 2nd floor until at least 4 a.m., processing overnight blood work and specimen testing. Crystal had been watching, learning, preparing. She knew their schedules better than they did. She knew their habits, their routines, their vulnerabilities. From the computer, she printed out the master key log, a document that showed which employees had access to which areas of the hospital. Crystal had convinced Brett Daniels months earlier that she needed expanded access for her supply duties, explaining that emergency situations often required her to access equipment stored in various departments. Brett had approved the request without much thought. After all, Crystal was reliable, trustworthy, and had never caused any security concerns. She now had keys to storage areas, equipment rooms and service corridors that most employees didn't even know existed. Crystal also printed out the security camera schedules, maintenance logs that showed when cameras were offline for cleaning or repair. She'd been monitoring these schedules for months, noting patterns in the coverage gaps. Tonight, cameras B7 and B12 in the basement were scheduled for their monthly sensor cleaning between 11:45 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. Camera C4 on the third floor had been malfunctioning intermittently for 2 weeks, cycling on and off every 20 minutes. At 9:47 p.m., Crystal took the service elevator to the basement and began what would look like routine inventory work. She wheeled supply carts between storage rooms, checked expiration dates on medications, and organized equipment with the same methodical precision she'd shown for 4 years. But she was also doing something else. She was testing the sound levels in different areas of the basement, dropping a pen to see how far the noise would travel, closing doors to determine which ones latched silently and which ones creaked, moving between the security cameras' fields of view to understand exactly where their blind spots were located. Crystal had measured these blind spots with a measuring tape during previous shifts, disguising the activity as routine equipment maintenance. She knew that camera B3 had a 4-foot gap in coverage near the mechanical room doors. Camera B9 couldn't see into the storage closets when their doors were open. Camera B15 had a dead zone behind the service elevator where someone could hide for up to 3 minutes without being detected. Security footage from that evening shows Crystal working alone in the basement for over 2 hours, occasionally disappearing from camera view for minutes at a time. Investigators would later realize she was timing these disappearances. Learning how long she could stay invisible before her absence might seem unusual to anyone monitoring the feeds. Crystal also used this time to prepare her escape routes. She tested the emergency stairwells to ensure the doors weren't alarmed during normal hours. She confirmed that the service tunnels connecting different buildings were unlocked and accessible. She located the hospital's emergency supply caches, which contained first aid materials she could use to treat any injuries she might sustain during her attacks. At 10:15 p.m., Crystal made a test run of her planned route through the hospital. Starting from central supply, she timed how long it took to reach each location where she planned to strike. Basement mechanical room, 2 minutes 40 seconds. Third floor administrative offices, 4 minutes 10 seconds via service elevator. Fourth floor cardiac unit, 5 minutes 30 seconds. She also timed how long it would take security to respond if an alarm was triggered. She'd been watching the security staff for months, noting how long it took them to investigate routine alarms and equipment malfunctions. Average response time to basement alarms, 6 minutes 20 seconds. Average response time to upper floor alarms, 4 minutes 50 seconds. Average response time to medical emergencies, 3 minutes 10 seconds. Crystal would have to work fast, but it was doable, especially if she could disguise the early attacks as accidents or medical emergencies, which would delay the investigation and buy her more time. At 11:15 p.m., Crystal returned to locker 247. She removed the claw hammer and slipped it into the large front pocket of her work scrubs, where it was completely hidden by the loose fabric. The weight of it against her leg felt like a promise she was finally ready to keep. She also removed a small digital camera from her duffel bag, a disposable one she'd purchased with cash weeks earlier. Crystal planned to document her work, not out of some sick desire to relive the violence, but as evidence that she'd completed her mission, proof that the 8 people who'd made her life miserable had finally paid for their crimes. The official night shift wouldn't begin for another 32 minutes, but Crystal Lucian had already been working for almost 3 hours. She'd prepared for every contingency, studied every detail, planned every movement. What she did next would make even hardened detectives question everything they thought they knew about workplace violence. At exactly 11:52 p.m., Tyler Morrison was alone in mechanical room B7, checking the overnight readings on the hospital's backup oxygen system. It was a routine maintenance task that took about 15 minutes and put him in the most isolated part of the basement, surrounded by the constant hum of machinery that would mask any unusual sounds. Tyler had no idea that Crystal Lucian had been tracking his movements for months, had no idea she'd been timing his routes, and knew he would be in that room alone for the next 12 minutes. The security camera in the corridor outside mechanical room B7 shows Crystal approaching at 11:53 p.m., pushing a supply cart that gave her a perfectly legitimate reason to be in that area. She paused outside the door, looking around to confirm she was alone, then knocked. Tyler, it's Crystal from Supply. I've got those replacement filters you requested. Tyler Morrison never requested any filters. The mechanical room door opened, and Tyler appeared in the doorway looking confused. Filters? I didn't... The camera angle doesn't show what happened next, but investigators would later find Tyler's body just inside the mechanical room, blood pooled around his head from massive blunt force trauma. The first blow had been to the back of his skull as he turned to look at the supply cart. The next 3 blows were insurance, delivered while he lay unconscious on the floor. It was 11:54 p.m. Crystal's first victim was dead in less than 60 seconds. What investigators would later find most chilling wasn't the brutality of the attack. It was how methodically Crystal had prepared for this moment. Tyler's blood was contained entirely within the mechanical room. No footprints leading away from the scene. No defensive wounds suggesting he'd fought back or even realized what was happening. Crystal cleaned the hammer handle with medical wipes from her supply cart, changed her blood-spattered scrubs for a clean set she'd hidden in the cart's bottom compartment, and sealed the contaminated clothing in a medical waste bag that would normally be incinerated the next morning. By 11:58 p.m., 4 minutes after Tyler Morrison's death, Crystal was back at her normal workstation in Central Supply, updating inventory sheets as if nothing had happened. But she was just getting started. At 12:23 a.m., Crystal received a routine call from the cardiac unit. Nurse Amber Johnson needed additional IV supplies for a patient who'd been admitted unexpectedly. It was the kind of request Crystal handled dozens of times each week. "I'll bring them right up," Crystal told her, loading a supply cart with the requested items. What Amber Johnson didn't know was that she hadn't been randomly selected for Crystal's attention. Amber was friends with Jolene Rivers. They often ate lunch together and had been overheard laughing about how weird Crystal was during a break room conversation 6 months earlier. Crystal remembered everything. The service elevator to the 4th floor was empty, as Crystal had expected. The cardiac unit at 12:30 a.m. was operating with minimal staff, just 2 nurses and a sleeping patient in room 4 and 12. Amber Johnson was alone at the nurses' station, updating patient charts on her computer. "Thanks for bringing these up so late," Amber said without looking up from her screen. "I know it's a pain to—" The hammer caught Amber in the right temple as she turned toward Crystal. Unlike Tyler Morrison, who'd been killed with multiple precision strikes, Amber Johnson died from a single massive blow that shattered her skull and sent her crashing into the computer monitor. The attack took place directly in front of the cardiac unit's main security camera. But Crystal had done her homework. She knew the camera's exact field of view and had positioned herself so that her body blocked the view of Amber's head and the hammer. To anyone reviewing the footage later, it would look like Crystal had tripped or accidentally bumped into Amber, causing her to fall and hit her head on the equipment. It would take investigators 3 viewings of that footage to realize they were watching a murder. Crystal calmly checked Amber's pulse, a natural response for any medical worker finding an unconscious colleague. Finding none, she walked to the nurse's station phone and dialed the hospital's emergency code. "This is Crystal Lucian in Central Supply. I'm on Cardiac 4 and I think Amber Johnson just had some kind of accident. She hit her head pretty bad. We need help up here." When the emergency response team arrived 6 minutes later, they found Crystal performing CPR on Amber Johnson, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what happened," Crystal sobbed to the responding physician. "She was talking to me, and then she just collapsed. I think she might have had a seizure or something." Crystal Lucian had just committed 2 murders in 31 minutes, and she was being praised for her quick thinking and compassionate response to a workplace emergency. But what she did next would make investigators realize this wasn't a case of unfortunate coincidences. This was the execution of a plan that had been years in the making, and Crystal Lucian was just getting started. The emergency response to Amber Johnson's accident created exactly the chaos Crystal had been counting on. Medical staff from across the hospital converged on the cardiac unit. Security supervisors were pulled upstairs to manage the scene. The basement levels, where Crystal needed to operate, were now virtually unmonitored. At 1:17 a.m., while hospital administrators were still trying to understand what had happened to Amber Johnson, Crystal was back in the basement, preparing for victim number 3. Veronica Santos was completing her nightly security rounds, checking supply closets throughout the hospital to ensure they were properly locked and stocked. It was a job that required her to work alone, moving through dimly lit corridors and service areas that most day shift employees never saw. Veronica's route was predictable. She'd been doing the same rounds for over 2 years. Crystal knew that at approximately 1:20 a.m., Veronica would be checking supply closet C12, a cramped storage room in the basement that contained cleaning supplies and rarely used medical equipment. Supply closet C12 was perfect for Crystal's purposes. No security camera, soundproof walls due to its location between 2 mechanical rooms, and most importantly, Veronica would be facing away from the door while checking inventory, making her completely vulnerable to attack. Crystal positioned herself around the corner from the closet, listening for Veronica's footsteps in the corridor. When she heard the familiar sound of keys jangling and the closet door opening, Crystal waited exactly 30 seconds, long enough for Veronica to move fully into the closet and begin her checklist. The attack was swift and brutal. Crystal entered the closet silently, raised the hammer, and brought it down on the back of Veronica's head, with enough force to kill her instantly. There was no conversation, no hesitation, no mercy. Veronica Santos had written on Crystal's birthday cake oversight list 2 years earlier. And now, she was dead. But as Crystal cleaned her hammer and prepared to move Veronica's body deeper into the closet, something unexpected happened. She heard voices in the corridor outside, maintenance workers who'd been called away from their normal duties to help with the emergency upstairs, but were now returning to their basement assignments. For the first time that night, Crystal felt a moment of panic. She quickly arranged Veronica's body to look like she'd fallen while reaching for supplies on a high shelf, then slipped out of the closet through a connecting door that led to an adjacent storage room. The discovery of Veronica Santos's body at 2:43 a.m. by maintenance worker Cody Peterson finally triggered the investigation that would uncover the full scope of Crystal's killing spree. "I thought she'd had a heart attack or something," Peterson would later tell detectives. "She was just lying there next to some boxes that had fallen. But when I called for help and they moved her, there was so much blood." By 3:15 a.m., LifeSpring Hospital was in full lockdown. 3 employees were dead: Tyler Morrison, Amber Johnson, and Veronica Santos, and hospital administrators were desperately trying to determine if they were dealing with a medical emergency, workplace accidents, or something far worse. Detective Shane Cooper arrived at 3:22 a.m. and immediately recognized what hospital administrators had missed. The pattern of head trauma on all 3 victims was consistent with blunt force injuries, not accidental falls or medical events. "This wasn't 3 random accidents," Detective Cooper would later say in his incident report. "Someone was systematically targeting night shift employees. We were dealing with an active killer." The hospital security footage was pulled and reviewed. Computer logs were analyzed to determine who had been in the building and when. Employee schedules were cross-referenced with victim locations. And slowly, a chilling picture began to emerge. Crystal Lucian had been present at or near every death scene. She'd been the one to discover Amber Johnson. She'd been working in the basement when both Tyler Morrison and Veronica Santos were killed. And according to the security logs, she'd been moving throughout the hospital during times when she should have been stationed in central supply. At 4:07 a.m., Detective Cooper requested that all night shift employees be gathered in the hospital cafeteria for questioning. It was a decision that would save lives, because Crystal Lucian wasn't finished with her list. But when security went to collect Crystal from central supply, they found her workstation empty. Her supply cart was still there, loaded with IV bags and medical equipment. Her computer was logged in and displaying an inventory spreadsheet she'd been updating. Crystal Lucian had vanished. The manhunt that followed would reveal the true scope of her revenge plan and the terrifying lengths she'd gone to ensure that every name on her list would be crossed off before the sun rose on October 16th. What investigators found in locker 247 and Crystal's apartment would chill them to the bone. But the most shocking discovery was still to come, because Crystal Lucian had planned for the possibility of being discovered, and she had a backup plan that no one saw coming. At 4:31 a.m., Detective Shane Cooper and hospital security forced open locker 247 using the master key. What they found inside would haunt the investigation team for years to come. A black composition notebook, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting documenting every perceived slight, every workplace injustice, and every reason why specific co-workers deserved to die. The notebook contained 43 entries dating back 3 years, but 8 names appeared repeatedly, each marked with increasingly violent fantasies and detailed murder plans. Tyler Morrison always acts like he's better than me, talks to pretty nurses but ignores me completely, needs to learn respect. Best approach: basement mechanical room, Tuesday nights between 11:45 to 12 CACs. Blunt force trauma to occipital bone should cause immediate death. Amber Johnson laughs about me with Jolene. Called me Weird Crystal in break room 4:15-19. Both need to pay. Cardiac unit late shift, usually alone at nurse's station. Single blow to right temple while she's distracted by computer work. Veronica Santos pretends not to know my birthday but remembers everyone else's. Fake smile, fake kindness. Won't be smiling much longer. Security rounds, supply closet C12, Tuesdays 1:30 a.m. Strike from behind while she's checking inventory. But the notebook contained more than just murder fantasies. Crystal had documented detailed surveillance of her intended victims, including their home addresses, family members' names, daily routines outside of work, and personal vulnerabilities she could exploit. She knew that Tyler Morrison's girlfriend Casey worked day shifts at a different hospital and that he usually called her during his dinner break at 1:15 a.m. She knew that Amber Johnson was taking evening classes to become a nurse practitioner and often studied during slow periods on the cardiac unit. She knew that Veronica Santos had recently started taking antidepressants after her divorce and had been struggling with the side effects. The notebook also contained detailed floor plans of the hospital that Crystal had hand-drawn over months of observation. Security camera locations were marked with red X's. Guard patrol routes were traced in blue ink. Areas with poor lighting or sound dampening were highlighted in yellow. Employee schedules going back 6 months were pasted into the notebook, with annotations showing when each target would be most vulnerable. Crystal had been planning this massacre with the precision of a military operation, studying her victims like a predator studies prey. But it was the final entries, dated October 15th, that made Detective Cooper's blood run cold. Tonight is the night. Tyler first. Basement, alone, unsuspecting. Then Amber, cardiac unit, isolated. Veronica during rounds. After that, Jolene, Brett, Shane, Dustin, and Bethany. 8 names, 8 crosses. They made me invisible, so I'll make them disappear. The entry continued. If I'm caught before finishing, Plan B is ready. Hospital roof access, 6th floor. 12-story drop should be sufficient. They'll find the notebook and understand why this had to happen. Better to die a legend than live as a ghost. Plan B, Crystal Lucian had planned to commit suicide if she couldn't complete her killing spree. But there was more. A loose page tucked into the back of the notebook contained what appeared to be a manifesto, a detailed explanation of Crystal's motivations, and a message she intended for the media. To whoever finds this, my name is Crystal Lucian, and I am not crazy. I am not a monster. I am someone who was pushed beyond her breaking point by a workplace culture that rewards popularity over competence, politics over performance, and cruelty disguised as normal social behavior. For 4 years, I worked harder than anyone else at LifeSpring Hospital. I stayed late when others went home. I covered shifts when others called in sick. I solved problems that others couldn't figure out. And what did I get for my dedication? I got ignored. I got passed over. I got treated like I was invisible. The 8 people on my list represent everything wrong with workplace dynamics in America. They created a toxic environment where bullying is disguised as team building, where exclusion is justified as cultural fit, and where good employees are discarded if they don't fit some arbitrary standard of social acceptability. Tyler Morrison treated me like I didn't exist, while openly flirting with prettier co-workers. Amber Johnson mocked me behind my back and encouraged others to do the same. Veronica Santos orchestrated my social isolation through calculated oversights and false kindness. Jolene Rivers stole opportunities that should have been mine through manipulation and charm. Brett Daniels consistently undervalued my contributions while rewarding less qualified candidates. Shane Cooper punished me for being dedicated, writing me up when I should have been commended. Dustin Park waltzed into a position I'd earned through years of hard work. Bethany Kim represents the type of employee who gets everything handed to her without effort. I am not the first person to be driven to violence by workplace bullying, and I won't be the last. But maybe my actions will finally force people to pay attention to the invisible employees, the ones who work hard and get nothing in return, the ones who are slowly destroyed by 1,000 small cruelties. Remember my name. Remember why this happened. And maybe next time you see a quiet co-worker eating lunch alone or working late without recognition, you'll think of Crystal Lucian and treat them with the basic human dignity I was denied. Detective Cooper immediately radioed for backup and ordered a complete sweep of the hospital. Crystal Lucian was still somewhere in the building, and according to her notebook, she had 5 more people to kill before implementing her suicide plan. The search began with the hospital's security system. Every camera feed was reviewed in real time. Every badge access was monitored. Every corridor and storage room was methodically cleared by teams of officers working in coordination with hospital security. At 5:12 a.m., security camera 7B in the 3rd floor administrative corridor captured footage that stopped the investigation team cold. Crystal Lucian, still wearing her blood-spattered work scrubs, was walking calmly toward the offices where Jolene Rivers was working overtime on inventory reports. But this footage was different from the earlier surveillance videos. Crystal was no longer hiding her intentions. She was walking directly toward the camera, making eye contact with the lens and holding her blood-covered hammer openly in her right hand. She wanted to be seen. She wanted there to be a record of what she was about to do. Detective Cooper and his team reached the 3rd floor at 5:15 a.m., but they were 3 minutes too late. They found Jolene Rivers dead in her office, her head caved in from multiple hammer blows. Unlike the earlier victims who'd been killed quickly and efficiently, Jolene had clearly suffered. The office showed signs of a prolonged struggle. Blood spatter patterns on the walls indicated Jolene had been conscious and trying to defend herself during the attack. Her hands showed defensive wounds where she'd tried to grab the hammer. Her desk chair was overturned, and papers were scattered across the floor where she'd apparently tried to crawl away from her attacker. Crystal Lucian had taken her time with this murder, made it personal, made Jolene pay for every slight, every stolen opportunity, every moment of recognition that Crystal believed should have been hers. But she was nowhere to be found. The manhunt expanded beyond the hospital. Crystal's apartment at 1247 Oak Street was searched, revealing more disturbing evidence of her long-term planning. Maps of the hospital were taped to her bedroom walls, with colored pins marking the locations where she'd planned each attack. Newspaper clippings about workplace violence incidents were organized in a scrapbook, with Crystal's handwritten notes analyzing what the perpetrators had done right and wrong. And most chilling of all, Crystal had been practicing her attacks on a mannequin she'd positioned in her living room. The mannequin's head was dented and cracked from repeated hammer blows, and face photos of her intended victims were taped to different parts of its body, showing exactly where she planned to strike each person. Detective Cooper was studying these photos when his radio crackled with an urgent update from hospital security. "We've got eyes on the suspect. 4th floor, east stairwell. She's heading toward the roof access." The roof access. Crystal's plan B was becoming clear. At 5:47 a.m., Detective Cooper and 2 hospital security officers reached the roof of LifeSpring Hospital. They found Crystal Lucian standing at the edge of the building, still holding the blood-covered claw hammer, staring out at the city skyline as dawn began to break over the horizon. She looked different now. The careful composure she'd maintained throughout the night was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. She'd accomplished part of her mission. 4 names had been crossed off her list. 4 people who'd made her feel invisible, would never ignore anyone again. "Crystal," Detective Cooper called out, his weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. "We need to talk." Crystal turned around slowly, and Detective Cooper would later describe the expression on her face as the most unsettling thing he'd ever seen in 15 years of law enforcement. Not angry, not upset, not even particularly emotional. Satisfied. "I got 4 of them," Crystal said matter-of-factly, her voice carrying clearly across the empty rooftop. "Tyler, Amber, Veronica, Jolene. 4 out of 8 isn't bad, considering I had less than 7 hours to work with." "It's over, Crystal. Put down the hammer and step away from the edge." Crystal looked down at the weapon in her hand as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. The hammer was covered in blood and hair, physical evidence of the 4 lives she'd taken. "You know what's funny, Detective Cooper? I spent 4 years being invisible in this place, 4 years of people like you walking right past me like I didn't exist. But I bet everyone sees me now." Detective Cooper recognized her use of his name and realized she knew exactly who he was. He was Shane Cooper, the security supervisor who'd written her up for tardiness. His name was in her notebook. He was supposed to be victim number 6. "You don't have to do this, Crystal. We can talk about what happened. We can—" "Talk?" Crystal laughed, and the sound carried an edge of hysteria that hadn't been there moments earlier. "I tried talking for 4 years, Detective. I tried being the good employee who worked hard and followed the rules and waited patiently for my turn. Do you know what that got me?" She gestured toward the hospital building behind her. "It got me 4 years of being treated like furniture, something useful when you need it, but invisible the rest of the time." What Crystal Lucian said next would become the most quoted confession in the department's history, a chilling insight into the mind of a workplace killer who'd spent years planning the perfect revenge. "They thought I was nobody, just the quiet girl who restocked supplies and never caused trouble. They thought they could ignore me, pass me over, laugh at me behind my back, and there would never be any consequences. But I was watching every single day. I was learning every single detail about their lives. I was getting ready to show them exactly who I really was." Crystal Lucian surrendered without further resistance at 5:52 a.m. on October 16, 2019. She'd killed 4 co-workers in 6 hours and would have killed 4 more if the investigation hadn't moved fast enough to stop her. The trial of Crystal Lucian began on March 3, 2020, and would become one of the most closely watched workplace violence cases in state history. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence: security footage, the revenge notebook, Crystal's detailed confession, and physical evidence linking her to all 4 murder scenes. But it was the psychological evaluation that provided the most disturbing insights into how an ordinary hospital employee had become a methodical killer. Dr. Kendall Flaming, the court-appointed psychiatrist, spent 40 hours interviewing Crystal Lucian over 6 weeks. Her findings revealed a woman who showed no remorse for her actions and continued to believe her victims had deserved to die. Crystal exhibited classic signs of paranoid personality disorder combined with narcissistic rage, Dr. Pat testified. She had spent years building elaborate justifications for violence against co-workers who she believed had wronged her. In her mind, she wasn't committing murder. She was correcting injustices. The notebook entries were read aloud during testimony, providing chilling insights into Crystal's thought processes. About Tyler Morrison. "He thinks he's too good to talk to me, but he'll talk when I show him what real power looks like." About Amber Johnson. "She laughs at me like I'm some kind of joke. Soon she'll learn that I'm the one with the last laugh." About Veronica Santos. "Fake kindness is worse than honest cruelty. At least cruel people are honest about who they are." About Jolene Rivers. "She stole my promotion and my future. I'm just taking back what was already mine." The prosecution argued that Crystal had shown premeditation, calculation, and an absence of any mitigating mental illness that would excuse her actions. The defense attempted to argue that years of workplace bullying and discrimination had driven Crystal to a psychological breaking point. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Crystal Lucian was found guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, she was given the opportunity to address the families of her victims. Her statement lasted less than 2 minutes. "I want everyone to understand that I didn't do this because I'm crazy or sick. I did this because actions have consequences. For 4 years, my co-workers treated me like I was invisible, They ignored my contributions, blocked my advancement, and made me feel worthless. Well, now they know I was never worthless. Now they know I had power they never imagined. And now they'll never forget who I really am. Crystal Lucian never apologized, never showed remorse, never acknowledged that her victims were innocent people with families, dreams, and futures that she had destroyed. The impact on LifeSpring Hospital was immediate and lasting. The facility implemented new security protocols, including mandatory employee wellness checks, expanded security camera coverage, and a zero-tolerance policy for workplace bullying or harassment. But the psychological impact on surviving employees was harder to address. Many quit within months of the murders. Others required extensive counseling to cope with survivors' guilt, and the realization that they'd worked alongside a killer for years without recognizing the danger. Dustin Walsh, a night shift supervisor who'd been on Crystal's target list but survived because of the early lockdown, struggled with the knowledge that he'd been marked for death by a co-worker he'd barely noticed. "I keep thinking about all the times I walked past her in the hallway," Dustin said during a victim impact statement. "All the times I probably should have said hello or asked how she was doing. Not because it would have changed anything, she was clearly planning this regardless, but because it makes you realize how invisible people can be, even when they're right in front of you." The case of Crystal Lucian sparked nationwide discussions about workplace culture, the warning signs of employee violence, and the responsibility of employers to address toxic work environments before they escalate into tragedy. This case shows how hidden resentment can fester into deadly obsession. What's your take on workplace dynamics? Have you ever witnessed toxic behavior that escalated? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more exclusive crime stories that are too intense for YouTube, join our insider community, link in the description. Plus, grab our new books, The Killer's Mind, Psychology Behind Shocking Murders, and Too Disturbing for YouTube, 7 Shocking Murder Stories by Mike Darren Boyle, both for the price of a coffee. Links below. Security experts now use the Crystal Lucian case as a teaching tool for recognizing the warning signs of workplace violence. The gradual isolation from co-workers, the obsessive documentation of grievances, the shift from passive resentment to active planning. But perhaps the most chilling lesson from this case is how effectively Crystal Lucian had hidden her true nature for 4 years. Her performance reviews were consistently positive. She had no history of violent behavior. Her co-workers described her as quiet but competent. The woman who methodically planned and executed 4 murders had been invisible in plain sight, gathering intelligence and nurturing her rage, while maintaining the perfect facade of a model employee. Crystal Lucian is currently serving her life sentence at Central State Correctional Facility for Women. According to prison officials, she spends most of her time in her cell, reading and writing in notebooks that are regularly monitored for content. She has never expressed remorse for her crimes, never shown interest in counseling or rehabilitation programs, and according to her most recent psychological evaluation, she continues to believe that her actions were justified responses to workplace persecution. The families of Tyler Morrison, Amber Johnson, Veronica Santos, and Jolene Rivers continue to struggle with the senseless loss of their loved ones. They've established a foundation focused on workplace safety and violence prevention, hoping that their tragedy might help prevent similar incidents in the future. But the question that haunts investigators, mental health professionals, and workplace safety experts remains unanswered. How many other Crystal Lucians are sitting quietly in offices, hospitals, and factories across the country, documenting their grievances and planning their revenge? The notebook found in Locker 247 contained one final entry that investigators discovered only during the trial preparation. Written in Crystal's neat handwriting on the very last page, it read, "If you're reading this, it means I succeeded in making myself unforgettable. They thought I was nobody, but now my name will be remembered long after theirs are forgotten. That's real power. That's real victory." Crystal Lucian achieved her goal of never being invisible again. But the price of that visibility was the lives of 4 innocent people and the shattered sense of security for everyone who knew her. In the end, the most disturbing truth about this case isn't that Crystal Lucian was a monster hiding among normal people. It's that she was a normal person who became a monster, one grievance at a time, one notebook entry at a time, one night shift at a time. And the most terrifying part? She's still out there in that prison cell, writing in her notebooks, convinced that she was the victim all along.